Hello and welcome to Hot Pursuit, part of Ahval podcast and video series. My guest today is from Brazil, Sao Paulo University International Relations Institute, visiting scholar Karabekir Akkoyunlu. Welcome, Karabekir.
Hello, Yavuz.
We gathered together to discuss Turkey, parts of the domestic policy and also its much observed deeply concerning from some parts foreign policy moves, regional policy, especially centering around Eastern Mediterranean. Libya, these days, as of 23rd of July, tension escalating between Greece and Turkey through Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. But also we have Hagia Sophia. 24th of July is an important date. It will remain an important reference date, arguably, in analyzing Turkey and also writing about Turkey in the future. From tomorrow on, from 24th of July on, Hagia Sophia will be converted back to a mosque status after serving as museum for many decades. And let's begin with that, Karabekir. It is, of course, apart from being a huge monument, a part of the global cultural heritage, filled with symbolic about Turkey's image, its future, its past, its today, its present, and also its relations with the Western world, with the democratic families of the world, etc. And also on another level, on religious layers as well. How do you see this turn, this ceremony that's basically marking Hagia Sophia as a mosque? How do you see it now, and what does it say about the future?
Mm-hmm. It's definitely an important symbolic date. It's definitely an important symbolic victory for political Islamist movement in Turkey, which has for decades championed or advocated the return of Hagia Sophia to mosque status. So when we look at the modern history of Turkey and look in particular to the trajectory of political Islam, its importance cannot be understated. And with this, the government and particularly President Erdogan would like to reaffirm their position as the leaders, both in Turkey and abroad, of Muslims in the world and of political Islam, of the movements that represent the Muslim community in the world. So, and of course, while it's meeting a lot of enthusiasm the world over, if you read, for instance, comments to Al Jazeera posts on this issue, you see that there's a lot of enthusiasm coming from Bangladesh, from Pakistan, and besides Turkey's own population. In the West, it's created a considerable sort of anxiety, or added to the additional anxiety. So it will distance Turkey for sure from its former Western partners, and
irreversibly.
I don't think anything is irreversible, as we have seen. Turkey's been zigzagging. So I wouldn't say that, but I would say it's an important symbolic gesture that has emotionally affected people both in Turkey and abroad. But if we look at it from the perspective of domestic politics, we see a different picture. We see a picture beyond
before going into domestic politics. Now that we are there, you mentioned Bangladesh, Pakistan, some Muslim countries. For what are the gains for Erdogan? When we ask this question, what the gains are for Erdogan, one point becomes quite lucid, which is for the Islamist movement in Turkey and elsewhere, Muslim Brotherhood, etc., the status of Hagia Sophia as a museum meant to a great deal that conquest of Istanbul by the Muslim forces led by Sultan Mehmet was incomplete. And some argue that Erdogan will have gained a lot of, or restored a lot of his image as the leader of the Muslim world, Islamist world, let's say, in the eyes of these masses on the grassroots, and as well as some states, as the second conqueror of Constantinople, Istanbul, or final conqueror of Istanbul, and therewith cementing his image as some sort of de facto sultan. Do you agree with that kind of symbolic? I think it's important to see when we look at the participants in the prayer in the ceremony, which states will send representatives, which will not. Of course, this will be telling to us whether or not, for example, Saudis will be represented there or not, and or the others, Moroccans, etc. So, what do you say? Do you find this argument reasonable?
Well, I think there's definitely an important, not only symbolic but ideological element that is not merely an attempt at self-satisfaction. There is a sort of political, both domestic and internationally political aim with this, and that is sort of reconfirming, as I said, the AKP's and Erdogan's position as the leader of the Muslim world through these narratives of conquest, through narratives of reconquest, if you will, which resonate, of course, further afield. To what extent they bring material benefits to this government is questionable, but nonetheless, that status is not to be underestimated. It is important. Of course, it is a very specific and very modern narrative as well. I would like to emphasize that. I mean, it's the idea that Istanbul's conquest has been incomplete or ongoing. It's a very modern narrative, of course, in reaction to the Kemalist trajectory of Turkey. But the Ottomans didn't have this type of a sort of preoccupation. They didn't consider Istanbul insufficiently conquered. They were quite comfortable in their skin in governing Istanbul with all its diversity. So I also find it very that the distance between the modern political Islamist narrative and its appropriation of the Ottoman history, the distance between that and the Ottoman reality or the history itself, quite striking. But it's a narrative, and that it doesn't matter. Truth is a victim in political sort of narratives. But I think this needs to be emphasized. There was no such desire to continue conquest of Istanbul under the Ottoman Empire. It is a very modern one, and I would say it has a lot to do with the transformation of what is today Turkey from a much more ethnically, culturally, religiously diverse into diverse societies into a very homogeneous Muslim and then later Turkish society, and then later the sort of domestic demographic shifts that have been taking place. So in a sense, I would think it is more of a conquest of the Anatolian sort of Muslim, Turkish, Sunni communities of modern Istanbul, more than an Ottoman conquest of Byzantine Istanbul that is sort of happening now, and it's a victory of that conquest in the long run.
Apparently, Erdogan doesn't perceive it that way that you analyze. I think he is in his world, in his representation of the world. I think it has much wider or broader significance than what you objectively analyze. But it is important to underline that this is the result of the modern Turkey's Islamist segments that saw Anatolia with a different lens than what the Ottomans have been seeing Hagia Sophia as. But let's go back to its significance in domestic scene. I think you are of the view that in terms of gains, political gains for Erdogan, Bahçeli power bloc, it was the reconversion of Hagia Sophia into a mosque was a premature move.
I think it's going to prove a Pyrrhic victory in terms of domestic politics, and I think as much as this symbolic ideological importance is necessary to underline both for domestic and international sort of fields, its pragmatic political aspect reflects a different story. This was a very important weapon in the arsenal of the Turkish government, and I think it has been used in a way that will not yield benefits in return that sort of meet the importance of the move for at least sort of Turkey's political Islamist movement. What do I mean by that? I think it reflects more the hegemonic crisis of this government than its hegemony of Turkish society. There is an ongoing economic crisis. There is the disassociation or disillusionment of many of the grassroots supporters of the Justice and Development Party, especially the younger generations, and a sort of search for alternatives, both within that tribe, within that camp, and which is now being manifested with the sort of establishment of parties like DEVA or Future Party by Babacan or Davutoğlu, or completely sort of going away from the sort of Islamist paradigm altogether. So, and this is reflected in the sort of electoral trend over the past 5 years, despite the growing sort of control of government over institutions and the growing inequality of the playing field. The government is finding it more and more difficult to manufacture consent that will reflect easily on the electoral field. So it is, in a sense, an attempt to consolidate the Islamic base, the political Islamist base, that I think Hagia Sophia has now been used as a card at this juncture. However, I struggle to see the sort of the benefits, the gains from this from an electoral perspective, because the issue of Hagia Sophia can be very important symbolically, ideologically, historically for a small minority of Turkey's population, but it's not a tangible issue for all these groups that I already mentioned, let alone wider society. It's not going to, if it sort of changes the mind of people who are considering to leave the AKP's ranks and make them go back to the AKP's ranks, I think it's going to be a very small portion of the electorate. As long as Turkey becomes a sort of a proverbial desert in terms of cultural, economic, social sort of diversity and productivity, and that's what's been happening. This disillusionment will continue, and even the use of such a powerful and historic and symbolic sort of maneuver or weapon such as Hagia Sophia's conversion won't stop that trend.
Worth noting in parentheses that those who desire a Sharia rule, according to a latest survey, it has increased considerably compared to 5 years ago. Maybe it's worth noting that there is some emboldenment of the Islamist segments about changes of fundamental changes in Turkey's administrative paradigms, let's say. But let's go back to Hagia Sophia's significance in a broader context of foreign policy. It is maybe important to see, we mentioned the date of prayers opening, official opening of Hagia Sophia again as a mosque, 24th of July, which is the anniversary of Lausanne Treaty. And there is a very geometrically growing sense abroad and also inside Turkey that all these regional policy moves regarding Eastern Mediterranean, Aegean, Libya, Syria and Iraq in the context of Misak-ı Milli, national oath, arguing that there is resurfacing discontentment with the Lausanne Treaty as seeing some sort of straitjacket for today's Turkey under this rule. Can we see all these moves as some sort of irredentism that is explosive, that is very hyper in the eyes of the world, some sort of unstoppable, maybe not irreversible, but unstoppable series of moves that aims to change, that aims to be a game changer in general in the regional policies? Mm-hmm. Can we?
Short answer, I think we can. Let me just add a caveat. 24th of July is not only the signing of Lausanne, but it's also the beginning of the second constitutional period. So there are two sort of
symbolic two layers,
responses there. For those who are aware of these dates, which is not many people, obviously. I think, more than a real sort of a necessity to settle accounts, historical accounts with Lausanne, what's happening, I think, is, or at least I try to understand it or explain it, as a reflection of the changing internal composition of the ruling coalition. So in that sense, I think, the symbolism comes later to a trend or to a dynamic that is caused by this a new composition. And that composition is a combination of political Islamists, the Milli Görüş branch, and part of that branch, now Erdoganists, and the sort of nationalists, ulusalcılar.
Or Turancılar, perhaps.
Or Turancılar. So, yes, I mean, a different, a wide spectrum of Turkish nationalists. But those that are not, with the exception of Perinçek, who's also, evolved a lot during this period. Those who also...
With Perinçek, we mean Doğu Perinçek, the leader of the...
Patriotic Party of Turkey. Anyways, we will digress if we go into Perinçek. But my point is that it is a combination of this nationalist and religious new sort of marriage or new merger. And in one sense, the aggressive military sort of tendency that is exposing itself or exhibiting itself in these various hotspots in the Eastern Mediterranean, Middle East, are a reflection of the sort of militarism or reminiscent of the militarism of the 1990s. And in fact, it's no surprise because some of the ideologues of that period are back in government.
Back in the game.
Back in the game. And it's their a worldview that is also being infused back into a government. But at the same time, this meets with a particular sort of imperial Islamist sort of worldview that is a leftover from the neo-Ottoman era. Not all of it is still there. The Davutoğlu strand is gone, but nonetheless, this sort of imperial neo-Ottoman
aspirations.
So I think it is a combination. It really reflects that merger, and it's inevitable that it would have these kind of foreign policy repercussions, in my opinion. But that also gives a sort of an explanation, or maybe an alternative explanation to those who think of this process as irreversible or unstoppable. This is such an opportunistic, pragmatic coalition that formed not out of ideological compatibility, but out of conditions, out of physical conditions, political conditions, which are very fluid. When those conditions change, which we cannot foresee now, the tendency or the sort of their reflection on the foreign policy will also change. So in that sense, I think we should open ourselves, keep our minds open to unexpected changes on the foreign policy level as well, because that has been the sort of trend so far. One thing I could say, however, is that as long as Erdogan is in power, he's going to keep doing what he's been doing so far very successfully, and that is maintaining, beneath all this sort of ideological and symbolic and political sort of discourse, an ultra pragmatic approach to domestic and foreign policy, an ultra flexible sort of approach to alliance making and breaking, and in the context of that, creating new policies that reflect the interest of the new alliances.
But it's a very delicate gamble that currently that the power is in. Do you foresee any war, any sort of hostility, open hostility? A lot of people are predicting confrontation with Egypt, for example, in the Libyan theater. If not on the Eastern Mediterranean, some say if Merkel hadn't intervened as intermediary, there would be some clashes between Turkish and Greek warships off Castellorizo Island. Mm-hmm. Do you see any war? Foresee any war?
Well, I mean, I think we cannot discount the growing risk of warm confrontation between not proxies, but directly between state actors.
State actors.
So, you know, the proxy war is already going on in Syria, for instance, and we're always talking about the possible evolution of that into a direct confrontation between the Syrian army and the Turkish army. To an extent, that has also happened. I don't think this is in the interest of any party, including the Turkish government. However, the dynamic in these situations is usually, I mean, the risk is when tensions rise to such a level, such an extent that it becomes impossible to contain the sort of dynamics, and they take a course of their own towards confrontation, even when, you know, originally, none of the parties were interested in such confrontation. So I don't think, you know, these posturings are not necessarily a sign of a real wish on the part of any of these governments for direct hostility, direct war with, say, Greece or with Egypt. However, they may not be able to control those dynamics. Most wars start like that.
So war hangs in the air, one may say, perhaps.
Hopefully not, but I think the specter of these type of confrontations is more present than before.
Mm-hmm. Karabekir Akkoyunlu, visiting professor with Sao Paulo University International Relations Institute. Thank you for this conversation.
Thank you very much.